Chapter 1. The ice on Kestrel Sound does not look like anything from a boat deck at 5 in the morning. It looks like fog that decided to sit still. Myra Calder had been reading that fog since she was 7 years old, and she still could not have told you, in plain words, what she was reading. She just knew when it was lying to her. That morning it was lying about a lead, a strip of open black water that looked wide enough to run the skiff through, cutting north between two pressure ridges toward the fishing grounds her grandfather had worked for 50 years. Myra looked at it for 4 seconds. Then she throttled down and turned the wheel 10 degrees east, away from it, without being told to. Behind her, wrapped in 3 coats and a scarf that had been red before it was anything else, Anders Calder made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Why'd you turn?" he said. It wasn't really a question. He asked it every single time, the same flat tone, like a man checking a scale was still balanced. "Lead's too straight," Myra said. "Real ones wander. That one's sitting on a pressure line. It'll close by the time we are halfway through it." Anders didn't answer for a moment. He was 74, built low and wide like something meant to survive weather rather than impress it, and he had a way of going quiet that made people nervous until they got used to it. Myra had had 22 years to get used to it. "Good," he said finally, and that was the whole conversation, and it was worth more to Myra than most conversations she'd had in her life. They ran a short check line along the shelf where the crab pot sat, hauling and resetting in a rhythm the two of them had done so many times together that neither one needed to speak to know what came next. It was cold in the ordinary way, the kind of cold that lived in your fingers rather than your face, and the sky was the flat white color it always was in the last stretch of winter, low and close, like a lid somebody had set down over the whole world and forgotten to lift. Myra hauled the third pot up over the rail, cursing softly at a tangle in the line, and Anders watched her work it loose with the patient, unhelpful expression of a man who had untangled that exact knot 1,000 times and had decided, this morning, that she needed the practice more than he needed the 10 seconds it would save. "You could help," she said, not looking up. "I am helping. I'm not doing it for you." "That's not the same thing." "No," Anders agreed, sounding pleased with himself in the small, dry way he got when he thought he'd won an argument he hadn't actually been having. "It surely isn't." She got the tangle loose, dumped 4 crabs too small to keep back over the side, and reset the pot, and when she looked up he was almost smiling, which for Anders Calder counted as open delight. It was, Myra would think much later, one of the last easy mornings either of them would have for a long time, and neither of them had the faintest idea of it yet, which was probably the only reason it stayed easy. Kestrel Sound was a hard place to love and an easy place to stay. 411 people, 1 general store, 1 church that did double duty as a meeting hall, and a harbor that froze solid enough by January that you could walk out to the buoys if you were foolish, which people occasionally were. The village sat at the mouth of a strait between 2 headlands, and the strait did something almost nowhere else on the coast did. Twice a year, on nights nobody could fully predict from a chart, the tide came through it not as a rise and fall but as a wall. The old-timers called it the Iron Tide, because it came in like something forged, all at once, 6 feet of water moving faster than a man could run, and it scoured the strait clean of ice in a single night before the cold clamped back down. Nobody had ever managed to write down exactly when it would come. You had to feel the water for days beforehand. You had to know it the way you knew a person's mood by the set of their shoulders. Anders knew it. He had known it for longer than most people in Kestrel Sound had been alive, and it was the reason boats had been finding their way in and out of that strait safely for 3 generations, in weather that had killed careful men from other harbors who trusted their instruments too much. He had never written any of it down. Myra had asked him once, when she was maybe 12, why there wasn't a book, some log, some chart with the old lead lines marked, something a person could study on a quiet night by lamplight instead of learning it the hard, slow, cold way. He'd looked at her for a long moment with an expression she hadn't understood at the time, something between amusement and a kind of grief, and said, "Water doesn't red." She understood it a little better now. Still not all the way. They were 3 miles out, pulling the last pot of the morning, when the sky did something Myra had never seen it do. It didn't get dark. It got quiet, a kind of visual quiet, the way a room goes still right before somebody says something nobody wants to hear. High up, above the cloud deck, 3 shapes passed over without a sound, moving too slow to be falling and too fast to be anything Myra had a name for. They were white and long, and they had no wings, and the cloud beneath them seemed to flatten out and go smooth as they passed, like water settling after something heavy had sunk through it. Her radio, which had been muttering low band chatter from the harbor all morning, went dead mid-sentence. Not static. Silence, the kind that has a texture to it, like something had reached out and simply closed a hand around the signal and squeezed until there was nothing left in it at all. Anders stood up in the stern without a word and looked north, toward the harbor, toward home, for a long time. His jaw worked once, like he was chewing on something he didn't like the taste of. "Pull the lines," he said quietly. "We are going in." By the time they reached the harbor, every boat radio in Kestrel Sound was dead, the general store satellite phone showed no signal, and the school's internet connection, the only broadband line in 80 miles, run up the coast at considerable expense 11 years earlier, was a blinking cursor on a black screen and nothing else. The meeting hall filled up fast for a village that size. People stood along the walls in their work coats because nobody had thought to take them off. Myra's older brother, Isaiah, who ran the fuel dock and had opinions about everything, was already at the front arguing with the 2 members of the village council who'd made it in before the roads iced over completely. "Everything's dead," Isaiah was saying, both hands spread flat on the folding table like he could physically hold the situation down. "Not just radios. The truck won't start. Digital ignition, sir, it won't turn over. Anything with a chip in it is dead as a doornail, and the diesel generator behind the store is running fine, because my uncle never let anybody replace the old point's ignition on it. Told him for years he was cheap. Guess we know now." "That's not possible," said Councilwoman Ruth Halvorsen, not because she disbelieved him but because she needed someone to tell her it wasn't. It was possible. Over the following 2 hours, in pieces, from people who'd been out on the water or up the ridge road when it happened, a picture assembled itself. Ships, 3 of them, enormous, white, seen distantly over the water to the south, moving with the eerie, unhurried patience of something that had never once in its existence needed to rush. No weapons fired. No demands made. Just a slow, patient silence that spread out from them and ate every signal it touched, the way frost creeps across a window 1 degree at a time until the whole pane has gone white. A trucker who'd made it in from the county road with a load half delivered stood near the wood stove describing what he'd seen at the way station 40 miles south, every light on the dash of his rig going dark at once, the engine dying mid-hill, and then, a full minute later, starting itself back up without him touching the key, idling smooth, and even as though nothing had happened at all, except that the radio now played, faintly, under the engine noise, a low, even tone that hadn't been there before and that he could not turn off no matter which button he pressed. "It's not broken," he kept saying, to nobody in particular, rubbing his hands together in front of the stove like he could scrub the memory off them. "That's the part that scares me. It's not broken. It's just not mine anymore." Myra listened to that from the back of the hall with a knot forming low in her stomach, and beside her, for the first time all morning, she saw her grandfather's composure crack, just slightly, just for a second, not fear exactly, but the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. Anders sat near the back through most of it, saying nothing, which was normal for him, except that Myra noticed he wasn't listening to the arguments at the front. He was watching the door. It opened just after noon. The man who came through it was not from Kestrel Sound. He was tall, pale in a way that wasn't quite the pale of cold weather, and he wore something that looked at first like a diving suit and then, on a longer look, like nothing anyone in that room had ever seen. No seams, no fastenings, a surface that seemed to drink the lamplight rather than reflect it. He did not carry a weapon. He carried, instead, a small dark device that he held out in front of him the way a man might hold out a lantern in a cave, and the whole room went silent around him without anyone deciding to be quiet. He spoke, and the words came out flat and slightly wrong in their rhythm, like something translated a half-second too late by a machine that had never heard a human joke and wasn't entirely sure what one was for. "This settlement is being catalogued," he said. "Your records, administrative, historical, navigational, personal, are being copied for review. This process is non-destructive. Cooperation is recommended and will be noted favorably." Ruth Halvorsen, to her enormous credit, found her voice before anyone else did. Catalogued for what? The man, the registry called him an adjunct, they would learn later, a rank somewhere between clerk and officer, tilted his head very slightly, the way a bird does at an unfamiliar sound, as if the question had arrived in a shape his mind wasn't quite built to hold. "For accuracy," he said. "A world cannot be governed until it is known. It cannot be known until it is recorded. We are very thorough. It will not take long." He turned the device toward the room, and for a moment nothing happened. Then, on a table near the front, the council's laptop, the one with the village's tax rolls and land records and 40 years of harbour logs on it, lit up on its own, screen flickering through file after file faster than any human I could follow, and went dark again, drained and finished, like something eaten from the inside. The adjunct studied the readout on his device with what might have been satisfaction, if satisfaction was a thing his face was built to show at all. Population, 411, he said. Fishing settlement. Agricultural yield, negligible. Strategic value, negligible. Compliance risk, low. He paused, scrolling, unbothered by the crowd of frightened people 6 feet away. There is a gap, he added, almost idly, the way a man might mention he'd misplaced a receipt. Navigational data for the Northern Strait is incomplete. No charted safe passage exists in your records beyond the outer buoys, and yet vessel traffic in and out of this harbour has continued for decades without incident, according to your own registry filings. This is inconsistent. He looked up. Myra, standing near the wall with her hood still up and ice still melting off her collar, felt her grandfather go very still beside her. Someone here holds that data, the adjunct said, to the room, pleasantly, the way a man might invite the room to a raffle. We would like it recorded. Nobody answered him. He seemed unbothered by that. He simply noted something on his device, said, "We will return," in the same flat, unhurried tone he'd used for everything else, and left, and the harbour went back to a silence that no longer felt anything like normal. Over the next 4 days, Kestrel Sound learned how the registry worked, mostly by watching what it did to other places. Word came in slowly, carried by the last few boats still willing to run the coast on dead reckoning and nerve, since every electronic chart plotter, every GPS unit, every autopilot in the region had gone the same useless way as the radios. 2 villages south, a fishing fleet that had trusted its instruments too completely had been quietly, bloodlessly grounded. Not attacked, simply rerouted. Their navigation systems fed false but perfectly confident data by something that now owned every signal those systems trusted. No shots fired. No need. A boat that believes a lie from its own instruments will run itself onto rocks all on its own, calm and confident right up until the hull opens. A crabber named Halvard, who'd made the run north with 2 cracked ribs and a boat riding low from a hasty patch job, sat in Ruth Halvorson's kitchen and told it plain, the way fishermen tell things when they've decided there's no use dressing it up. Screen said we had 40 fathoms under the keel, he said, turning a mug of tea slowly between his hands without drinking any of it. Said it clean and confident, right up until we hit the rock at 8 knots. Wasn't a glitch. Wasn't static. It just lied to us. Sure of itself the whole time. My boy was below decks. We got him out. Boat didn't make it. 3 others didn't either, that we know of. He looked up. Point is, it didn't have to fire a shot. It just had to make us trust the wrong number, and we did, because we always had. Anders listened to that story without much expression, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched in 20 minutes, turning it slowly by the handle without lifting it. That's the whole trick, he said, mostly to himself. You don't fight a man who believes his own numbers. You just feed him better numbers than the truth, and let him walk himself off the edge thinking he's doing everything right. And us? Myra asked, pulling a chair around backward and sitting on it the way she'd sat in that kitchen since she was small enough that her feet didn't reach the floor. We don't have a chart worth stealing. No, Anders agreed. We've got a chart worth nothing, on paper. That's the difference. They can copy every line on it in a second and it still won't get a boat through that strait, because the line moves every year, and the only thing that ever tracked where it moved to was sitting in somebody's head. In between the fear, small, strange, ordinary things kept happening, the way they always do. Ruth Halvorson's mother, 91 years old and mostly interested in her garden these days, dug an ancient manual typewriter out of a closet and set it up on the counter of the general store so people could leave messages for each other the way they used to before telephones. A running, clattering, 2-finger correspondence that within a week had become the closest thing the village had to a newspaper, complete with a running gag about somebody's missing dog that had half the town in genuine. Stitches by the 4th day, the first real laugh anyone in Kestrel Sound had managed since the ships came over. Isaiah taped a hand-drawn sign to the fuel dock that read payment in cash, favors, or fish, robots not accepted, and refused, with great dignity, to explain the joke to anyone who didn't already find it funny. It took 3 more days for the registry to fully understand what it was dealing with in Kestrel Sound, and the village watched that understanding arrive with something close to grim amusement, in the middle of everything else that was frightening. They came back with a proper survey team, 4 adjuncts and a device larger than the first, mounted on a sled that hovered a foot above the snow without visible support and left no track behind it, which unsettled the dogs in town more than it unsettled the people. They copied every land deed, every school record, every church register going back 110 years, every logbook in every boat shed, working through the village with the same patient, unhurried thoroughness a tide moves through a tide pool, touching everything, missing nothing that could be touched. What they did not have, at the end of 2 full days of it, was a single mile of the Northern Strait charted past the outer buoys, because no chart of it had ever existed. What they had, instead, filed in old harbour logs going back decades, were entries in a dozen different hands, spelling drifting, ink faded, that said things like, "Ran the North Passage this morning, and a sea said wait for the tide to turn, glad we did, and Calder took the Whitfield boys through after the blow, 3 hours ahead of when anyone else would have tried it, don't ask me how he knew, and nothing whatsoever about how." The senior adjunct, a woman the village came to know only as Overseer Thal, cold and precise and visibly irritated by things that didn't resolve cleanly, called a second meeting in the hall. She did not bother with the pleasant tone the first adjunct had used, and she did not sit or stand near the door the way the first one had. She stood at the very front, under the lamp, where everyone in the room had to look at her whether they wanted to or not. "Your fishing fleet uses the Northern Passage regularly, in conditions our models classify as impassable," she said. "There is no chart. There is no data trail. There is no training record for whoever performs this navigation. This is either a significant and deliberate concealment, or your models of your own capability are wrong. I would like to know which." Nobody in the hall answered her directly. 100 pairs of eyes moved, without meaning to, toward the back row, where an old man in a red scarf sat with his hands folded and his face giving away exactly nothing. Thal followed the look. She studied Anders for a long moment, the way a buyer studies a piece of equipment she suspects is broken and is trying to decide whether it's worth the cost of repairing. "You," she said. "Your name does not appear in any licensing record, certification, or formal maritime authority for this region. And yet your name appears, informally, in 40 years of logbooks belonging to other men's boats." "I never had much use for licenses," Anders said. "Then how do your neighbors trust you to guide them through water our instruments class as lethal?" Anders considered the question the way he considered everything, slowly, like he was checking it for a soft spot before he stepped on it. "Same way you trust a man to know his own hands," he said. "You watch him work for 40 years and he's never once been wrong." Thal's expression didn't change, but something in the room's temperature did. "That is imprecise," Thal said. 40 years without error is not luck. It is a system. Every system can be described. Describe it." "I could talk for the rest of the night," Anders said, "and I still wouldn't get all the way through it, because half of what I know I only know the second I'm standing on the water feeling it. I don't have it sitting in a drawer somewhere I can hand you. There's no drawer. There's just 50 winters, and me, and I'm the only place all of that's ever lived at once." "Then you are a significant point of failure," Thal said, "and a significant point of failure is precisely the sort of thing our process exists to eliminate. Either the knowledge is transferred to a durable, reviewable record, or it remains dependent on a single biological unit of uncertain longevity. Neither outcome is acceptable to leave unresolved. We will require that knowledge recorded," she said, "for safety of transit, for accuracy of the catalogue." "It's not the kind of thing you can record," Anders said. "Water doesn't hold still long enough to write down." "Everything holds still long enough to write down," Thal said, and for the first time, there was something under the flatness of her voice that sounded almost like impatience with a child. "You simply haven't been asked properly yet." They left it there for the moment, which frightened Myra more than a threat would have. Thal did not seem like a woman who let a loose thread sit for long, and everyone in the hall that night had walked home with the same unspoken understanding. This wasn't finished, it was only paused. Life in Kestrel Sound tried, in the days after, to arrange itself around the shape of the occupation the way water arranges itself around a rock, not accepting it, exactly, just finding the path still open. School kept meeting because Ruth Halvorsen refused to let it stop, teaching lessons on a whiteboard with a marker instead of the dead projector. The fuel dock kept running on the old points ignition generator Isaiah's uncle had never modernized, and people started, half-jokingly at first and then not jokingly at all, hunting through sheds and barns for every piece of pre-digital equipment they owned, the way you'd stockpile candles before a storm, hand-crank flashlights, wind-up clocks, a typewriter somebody's grandmother had kept as decoration for 30 years, and that was suddenly, absurdly, the most valuable object in her house. Down at the end of the public dock, half sunk in ice, sat the Constance, a harbour tug nearly as old as Anders himself, iron-hulled, diesel, with a wheelhouse that still had a physical compass bolted to the binnacle instead of a screen. She'd been retired from active towing work a decade earlier when the co-op bought something newer and faster, and since then she'd mostly served as a floating storage locker for chain and old net. Nobody had gotten around to stripping her for parts, mostly out of the same stubborn regional habit that had kept Isaiah's uncle's generator running on points instead of electronics, a kind of low-grade, unexamined refusal to throw away anything that still, technically, worked. Myra found her grandfather standing on the dock beside the Constance one grey afternoon, hands in his coat pockets, just looking at her the way he sometimes looked at the water before a run. "They'll come for her eventually," he said, without turning around. "Anything that still runs is going to matter before this is over." "You think it's going to come to that? Boats, against them." "I think," Anders said, "a thing that conquers by reading every record on a planet is eventually going to run up against something it can't read, and it's not going to like that, and it's going to want to fix it. And I think the only thing on this coast that scares them even a little bit is the one stretch of water they can't get their numbers to agree on." He was quiet for a moment, watching a gull work the tide line, riding the little waves in and out with a patience that had nothing to do with anything happening on land. "I've been teaching you the sound your whole life," he said. "Not on purpose, most of it. Just taking you out, letting you watch, letting you get it wrong until you got it less wrong. I never wrote a word of it down because I didn't think there was any hurry. Figured we had years." Myra felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with the cold. "There's a hurry now," Anders said. She wanted, badly, to argue with him, to tell him there was plenty of time, that he'd be the one reading the water when it mattered, that this was just an old man being dramatic about a bad week. But she had spent 22 years learning not to argue with the particular stillness in his voice when he meant something all the way through, and she recognized it now, the way you recognize weather changing before the first drop falls. "Teach me the tide, then," she said instead. "The iron tide. All of it. Not just the run-through, the whole feel of it coming." Anders looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face, tired and proud and afraid all at once, though he'd never have used any of those words out loud, settled into something like relief, the particular relief of a man who has been carrying a weight alone for longer than he meant to. "It's coming this month," he said. "Late. Maybe 11 days out, maybe 14. You don't read it from a calendar. You read it from the way the pressure ridges start talking to each other 3 days before, groaning back and forth across the strait like they're arguing about something. You read it from the way the seals stop hauling out on the ice a full day ahead of anybody with a barometer, like they know something the barometer doesn't. And you read it from the way the air over the strait goes the particular kind of still that isn't the same as any other kind of still, heavier, almost, like the whole sky is holding its breath." "That's not a lesson," Myra said. "That's a riddle." "It was always a riddle," Anders said. "That's why they can't steal it. You can't copy a feeling out of a man's chest with a machine built to copy paper. You can copy the words I just said to you, easy as anything. You still won't be able to read the strait off them. You'll only be able to read the strait once you've stood on it enough times that the words stop mattering and the feeling takes over on its own." 6 days after that, whenever the weather and the work allowed it, Anders took Myra out onto the ice at the mouth of the strait and made her stand still and listen to nothing, which turned out to be the hardest thing he had ever asked of her. "You're thinking too loud," he told her, the third morning, when she reported hearing nothing but wind and her own heartbeat. "Stop trying to catch it. Let it come find you." She stood on the ice until her toes went numb inside her boots, listening past the wind for the low groan of the pressure ridges, learning to tell one kind of creak from another the way a mother learns to tell one cry of her infant from another across a house. By the 5th day she could feel the difference between ice settling under its own weight and ice being pushed by a current underneath, a distinction that had no name either of them had ever bothered to give it, because there had never been any reason to write it down for someone who wasn't standing right there feeling it too. On the 4th morning, cold and frustrated and half convinced she was simply not built for this the way her grandfather was, Myra sat down hard on an overturned bucket and said, "How am I supposed to learn something in a week that took you 50 years? Anders considered this with the enormous seriousness he brought to every question, however ridiculous. "You're not," he said. "You're learning it in 22 years and 1 very hard week. I had a 30-year head start on you the day you were born, sitting in that boat next to me before you could talk. You've been hearing this water your whole life. You just didn't know you were allowed to trust what you were hearing. He nudged her boot with his. Get up. The ice doesn't care that you're tired. Neither do I, particularly. You're a terrible teacher, Myra said, getting up anyway. I'm the only one you've got, Anders said, which has always worked out fine for both of us so far, and there was enough warmth buried in the flat, dry delivery of it that Myra laughed despite herself, the sound startling a pair of gulls off the ice 30 feet away, and for a moment, standing there with her breath fogging in the cold and her grandfather almost smiling beside her, the whole occupation felt very far away indeed. The registry, meanwhile, did not forget its loose thread. They returned twice more that week, briefly, methodically, and each time Thal's questions grew more precise, more clearly aimed, less willing to accept the same answers. She began interviewing individual fishermen, one at a time, in the back room of the general store, asking each of them the same handful of questions about the Northern Passage in a slightly different order. The way, Ruth Halvorsen observed grimly afterward, you might interrogate a dozen witnesses to see whose story didn't match. Every single fisherman in Kestrel Sound, without any of them planning it or agreeing on it beforehand, gave her the exact same true, useless answer, ask Anders. It bought them time. It did not buy them safety. On the 9th day, word came down the coast, carried, as everything now was, by a boy on a snow machine, because that was faster and more reliable than anything with a battery in it, that 2 villages north, the registry had begun what Thal's counterpart there was calling, without apparent irony, administrative consolidation, moving entire populations into a central processing site to be catalogued more efficiently. Nobody who'd gone in had come back out yet to say what that meant, and the not knowing sat over Kestrel Sound like whether nobody wanted to name out loud. Ruth Halvorsen made the decision within the hour, with the council's blessing and half the village crowded into the hall to hear it. Kestrel Sound would not wait to be told to consolidate. The very old, the very young, and anyone with a reason to fear a registry file with their name in it would go north that night, up the coast, to scattered relatives and a hunting camp far enough inland that the registry's landers, heavy, slow over broken ground, built for open flatland, would have a hard time following quickly. The only way there by water, in winter, past ice that would eat a boat running on guesswork, was through the northern strait. Anders stood at the wheel of the lead boat that night, and for the first time in Myra's memory, he did not touch it. Your hands, he said, stepping back from the wheel in front of 40 frightened people wrapped in every blanket the village owned, packed into 3 boats behind them in the dark. Mine are steady enough. Yours are ready enough. I'd rather prove that tonight, with me standing right here beside you, than wait for a night I'm not. Myra's mouth went dry, but she took the wheel. She read the ice the way he'd taught her without ever quite calling it teaching, not as lines on a chart but as a kind of listening, watching the way the hull's own vibration changed half a second before the ice ahead thickened, feeling the wind shift off the headland and knowing, in her stomach before her head caught up, what that meant about the lead that had looked open 100 yards back. Behind her, packed shoulder to shoulder in 3 following boats, 40 people sat in silence, trusting a 22-year-old they'd watched grow up, because there was nothing else left in that country worth trusting more. Twice she turned the wheel before Anders would have said a word, and twice, when she glanced back at him in the dark, she saw him give the smallest possible nod, not praise, just confirmation, the highest compliment the man had ever paid anyone in his life. Behind her, a young mother named Petra Voss sat with a sleeping toddler wrapped against her chest and her free hand gripping the gunwale hard enough to whiten her knuckles, and somewhere in the second hour, when the boat rocked hard over a shelf of broken ice and half the passengers gasped, Petra caught Myra's eye in the dark and asked, very quietly, "Do you actually know where you're going, or are we all just hoping?" Myra thought about lying, the way a kinder person might have. She didn't. Both, she said. Mostly the first one. Enough of the first one. Petra let out a short, surprised laugh, more relief than humor, and settled back against the boat's rail. Good enough, she said. Better than most answers I've gotten this week. It took 3 hours. It should have taken 5, by the estimate the older fisherman would have given for a passage that dangerous, that late in the season, in the dark, with no lights allowed for fear of being seen from above. Once, halfway through, the ice ahead of them groaned in a way that made every person in the lead boat go rigid, and Myra, without stopping to think about it, cut the engine to an idle and let the boat drift for 11 long seconds while she listened, feeling for whether that groan was ice settling or ice moving, and only when she was certain, bone certain, the kind of certain that had nothing to do with knowing and everything to do with feeling, did she push the throttle forward again and carry them through. When the lead boats both finally scraped up onto the gravel beach at the hunting camp and the passengers began climbing out into the arms of relatives who'd been waiting since dusk with lanterns held high against the dark, Myra stood at the wheel for a long moment with her hands shaking, not from fear anymore but from something that felt disconcertingly close to joy. Anders put a hand on her shoulder. "There it is," he said quietly. "That's the whole trade, right there. Nobody can take that away from you, because nobody but you was ever inside it while it happened. They can copy every word I ever say about it and they still won't have what you're holding right now." For one night, standing on that beach with the boats safely landed and the strait behind them still uncharted, unrecorded, and utterly, defiantly theirs, it felt like they had already won something real. They had not. Val did not take the empty half of Kestrel Sound's population well. She arrived at the harbour 2 mornings later with 6 adjuncts and a device the size of a small boat itself, mounted on a hovering sled, and she did not bother with a meeting hall this time. She went straight to the dock, straight to the water, and stood looking north up the strait for a long, silent minute before she turned to the small crowd that had gathered, kept back by nothing but the general understanding that approaching her closely seemed unwise. 41 individuals move through waters our systems classify as unnavigable, at night, with no instrumentation, in under 3 hours, she said. This settlement has been withholding operational capability from its own catalogue entry. That is a materially significant discrepancy, and discrepancies of that scale are not permitted to persist. "It's not withholding," Ruth Halvorsen said, stepping forward with more steadiness than she probably felt. "It's just not the kind of thing that goes on paper." "Everything goes on paper," Val said, "once it is properly extracted." She turned, and her gaze settled, unhurried, on the far side of the crowd, where Anders Calder stood with Myra half a step behind him, close enough that she could feel him breathing. "You," Val said again, and this time it was not a question at all. "You will provide the navigational data for the Northern Passage. Verbally, if written form is genuinely beyond your settlement's capacity. It will be recorded, transcribed, and verified against instrument data on the next transit. This is not a request." "I've told you," Anders said, and his voice was steady, though Myra, standing close enough, could feel how much that steadiness was costing him. "It's not a set of numbers. It's not a rule I follow. It's a feel I get, built out of 50 years of getting it wrong until I'm mostly stopped. You record what I say and you'll have words. You won't have the thing the words are about." "Then we will record the words," Val said, "and we will let the instruments determine what use, if any, remains for the man." It happened fast, the way bad things in that country always seem to happen fast after a long, slow build-up. 2 adjuncts stepping forward, a device raised, Anders's hand coming up not in surrender but simply to keep himself upright as the pull of something Myra had no name for closed around him. He did not shout. He looked back at her once, over his shoulder, in the half-second before they had him in the sled, not afraid, or not only afraid, but with an expression she would spend the rest of her life trying to properly describe to people who hadn't seen it. The look of a man handing off a weight he had trusted her to carry long before either of them had known it would come to this. "You already have it," he said, just loud enough for her to hear. "Everything I've got. It's already yours. Don't let them tell you it isn't, just because they can't see it." Then the sled lifted, and turned, and carried him south, and the crowd on the dock stood in a silence that had nothing polite in it at all. Isaiah had to catch Myra by the shoulder before she took 3 running steps toward a sled that was already 50 feet up and gone, and she stood in his grip shaking, not with tears yet, those would come later, alone, but with something closer to fury, a kind of cold, focused anger that felt, oddly, like the first useful thing she'd felt all week. Val lingered a moment longer than her adjuncts, studying the crowd with the same flat, assessing patience she brought to everything, and for just a second her gaze crossed Myra's and held there. Whatever she saw, it didn't register as a threat. Myra could tell that much from the way the overseer's attention simply moved on, filing the granddaughter under whatever category the daughter of an uncooperative asset belonged in, unremarkable, unlisted, not worth a second look. It was, Myra would think much later, the single greatest mistake the registry made in the whole occupation, and it cost them nothing to make and everything to have made. Ruth Halvorsen found Myra an hour after that, sitting alone at the end of the dock with her knees pulled up against the cold, and didn't say anything comforting, because there wasn't anything comforting to say. She just sat down next to her, and stayed, and after a long while Myra finally asked the question that had been sitting in her chest since the sled disappeared. "What if I'm not enough? What if everything he taught me isn't enough, and I get people killed finding that out?" Then you'll have tried the only thing anybody's got left to try, Ruth said. That's not nothing, Myra. That's most of what living here has ever been. The hall filled again that night, the way it always did now when something happened that the village needed to hold together to survive, but this time nobody had much to say. Ruth Halvorsen stood at the front for a long time before she spoke at all, and when she finally did, her voice was rougher than usual. We are not going to get him back by asking nicely, she said. I think we all know that by now. We are not soldiers, someone called from the back, an older fisherman named Colton who'd known Anders since they were boys. We are not anything. We are 400 people and some boats. He's not asking us to be soldiers, Isaiah said, standing near the front with his arms crossed, looking, Myra thought, older than he had a week ago. He's the one who kept saying it. The water's the only thing they can't get their numbers to agree on. That's not nothing. That's the only card we've got left, and he made sure at least one of us knew how to play it before they took him. Every head in the room turned, again, the way they had turned once before, except this time it wasn't toward the back row where Anders used to sit. It was toward Myra, standing near the wall with her hood down and her face pale and set, and she understood, in that moment, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that whatever came next was hers to carry whether she felt ready for it or not. I don't know the tide the way he does, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. I don't know if I know it well enough. I won't lie to any of you about that. None of us know if you know it well enough, Ruth said gently. That's not something anybody can tell you in advance. It's something you find out by doing it. That was true for him once too, wasn't it? Myra thought of her grandfather at 19, a boy she had never met and could barely imagine, standing on this same ice for the first time with nobody at all to tell him whether he was reading it right. Somebody, once, long before her, must have decided to trust him anyway. All right, she said. Then somebody had better start looking for a boat. Myra did not sleep that night, or the one after. She stood on the dock in the dark with her hands jammed in her coat pockets, listening to the Strait the way her grandfather had taught her to listen to it, and for the first 18 hours she was terrified that all she was hearing was ice and wind and her own fear talking back to her in his voice, and nothing else at all. Then, on the second night, she felt it. The pressure ridges out past the headland had started talking to each other. A low, occasional groan passed hand to hand across the ice field, the sound Anders had once described as the Strait clearing its throat. The seals that had been hauling out on the flat ice near the point all week were gone by morning, every one of them, without a single person having to tell her that meant anything. The air over the water went still in a way that wasn't like any other stillness, heavy and expectant and faintly metallic, the way the air smells right before lightning, except there was no storm anywhere on the horizon, only that low, waiting quiet stretched over the whole strait like a held breath. The iron tide was coming. Not in 14 days. Not even in 11. Something in the winter had shifted early, the way it sometimes did, and Myra understood, standing on that dock with her heart hammering, that it was coming in 2 nights, maybe less, and that nobody alive but her had the faintest idea how to read that arrival, because the only other person who could have been carried south in a registry sled 3 days earlier with words being pulled out of him one recorded sentence at a time. Words that would tell them nothing true about a thing that could only be felt. She went to Ruth Halvorsen that night with a plan that sounded, even to her own ears, like something out of a story nobody would believe. The registry's forward processing site sat 6 miles down the coast, in a cove that had, before the invasion, belonged to a defunct cannery, chosen, Myra guessed, because it was one of the few places along that stretch with water deep enough close to shore for their relay vessel to sit anchored while its systems recalibrated against a fixed terrestrial point. It needed to be still, and it needed to be close, because whatever the registry's instruments were built to trust, they were built to trust it against something solid and unmoving nearby, a local reference. That closeness, that stillness, was the only vulnerability anyone in Kestrel Sound had ever seen it show. And on the night the iron tide came through, the water in that cove would not be still. It would not be anything close to still. It would move 6 feet in an hour, all at once, faster than any current the registry's instruments, built and calibrated everywhere else on Earth by satellite and seabed sensor and every recorded oceanographic model humanity had ever filed, had any record of it all, because nobody, in the entire history of that coastline, had ever managed to write it down. You want to take the constants into that cove, Isaiah said, when Myra laid it out at the fuel dock the next morning, pacing back and forth in front of the old tug like the idea might get less crazy if he walked around it enough times. On the one night the water in this whole region is actively trying to kill anything on it, to hit an anchored alien warship with a 60-year-old tugboat. I want to hit it while the tide's doing the one thing their instruments have never once seen, Myra said, standing her ground. They're anchored close to shore because they need a fixed reference. The iron tide is going to take that reference and throw it 6 feet sideways in under a minute, and their systems are going to spend that minute trying to decide the ocean is malfunctioning instead of noticing a 100-ton hull coming at their anchor line. And you know exactly when that minute's going to be. No, Myra admitted, and it cost her something to say it out loud. I know how to feel for it. That's not the same as knowing. It never was, for him either. He was wrong sometimes too, when he was young. He told me that once. The difference is he kept going out anyway, until he wasn't wrong anymore. Isaiah looked at her for a long moment, the particular look of a man doing the math on how much he was willing to lose and coming up, reluctantly, with an answer he didn't like. Then I'm coming, he said, and so is the Constance, and God help us both. They spent the next day and a half preparing in near silence, welding a length of heavy salvage chain to a fitting on the tug's bow that had never been meant to carry that kind of load, stripping anything loose off the deck that the current might tear free and turn into a weapon against them, and checking, over and over, an old diesel engine that had every reason in the world to fail them and had, so far, stubbornly refused to. On the second afternoon, Myra and Isaiah took a smaller skiff down the coast, hugging close under the tree line, to look at the cove itself for the first time with their own eyes rather than second-hand descriptions. They came at it from the ridge above, on foot the last half-mile, and lay flat in the snow at the tree line looking down at the relay vessel from a distance Myra judged, with a fisherman's eye rather than a soldier's, to be somewhere around a mile. It was larger up close than either of them had let themselves imagine. Its hull curved up out of the black water without a single visible seam, running lights tracing slow, patient patterns across its surface, and even from that distance Myra could feel something coming off it that had nothing to do with sound, a kind of pressure in the air, the way you can feel a big engine running before you can hear it. There, Isaiah murmured, pointing. 2 adjuncts stood on a narrow platform near the water line, doing something methodical to a housing built into the hull just above the surface. That's got to be where the anchor lines terminate. If that housing's where I think it is, it's maybe 8 feet above the water at low tide. Less once the surge starts pushing water up the beach. Which means it'll be right about at bow height on the Constance, once the tide's running, Myra said, doing the math in her head the way her grandfather had taught her to do every kind of math that mattered, by feel first and number second. Good. That's good. That's insane is what that is, Isaiah said, but he was already sketching the angle in the snow with a gloved finger, working out a line of approach, because being scared and being useful, in the Calder family, had never been mutually exclusive. They lay there another 20 minutes, watching, memorizing the shape of the cove, the location of the rocks that would need avoiding, the narrow gap between the headland and the vessel's stern where a small boat running dark might pass unnoticed, before they backed away from the ridge on their bellies and did not stand up again until they were well below the skyline. They went out an hour before what Myra's whole body told her, in a language she still didn't fully have words for, was the leading edge of the tide, engine at a bare idle, running dark, the Constance's old iron hull creaking against ice that hadn't fully released yet but was starting, in 100 small groaning ways, to loosen its grip on the strait. The cove came up out of the dark ahead of them, and there it sat, the registry relay vessel, smaller than the command ships that had first crossed the northern sky but still larger than anything Kestrel Sound had ever built a harbour for, its hull a pale, seamless white, anchored fore and aft on lines that vanished down into black water it clearly trusted to hold still. Myra brought the Constance in along the shadow of the headland, engine barely turning over, running purely on the memory of every hour she'd spent on that water since she was 7 years old, translating a feeling in her chest into fractions of a degree on an iron wheel. Isaiah crouched in the bow with the coil of heavy chain and the grim, focused silence of a man who had decided, somewhere in the last hour, that he was not going to think too hard about what he was doing. Twice, in the last quarter mile, Myra felt the deck shift under her in a way that made her stomach drop, the current already restless beneath them, testing its own strength early the way it sometimes did before the Real surge arrived. Both times she eased off the throttle instead of fighting it, letting the Constance ride the small swells sideways rather than plow through them, because Andis's voice was in her head now as clearly as if he was standing at her shoulder. You don't fight water that's still making up its mind. You wait for it to decide, and then you go with what it decided. Getting close, Isaiah called back, low, not quite a whisper but close to it, one hand braced on the anchor chain, the other on the rail. I know, Myra said. Her hands were steady on the wheel. Her heart was not. The water changed first as a sound, a low note under everything else, felt through the soles of Myra's boots on the deck before it reached her ears. Then it changed as a push, the whole surface of the cove tilting almost imperceptibly, the way a tabletop tilts a half-second before a full glass slides. For one terrible moment, the Constance caught a cross-current off the headland that Myra hadn't felt coming, and the tug's bow swung 5 degrees off a line before she wrestled it back, the old will fighting her with a kind of stubborn, arthritic resistance that no amount of strength could shortcut. Her arms burned. Somewhere behind her, a loose coil of rope skidded across the deck and went over the rail into the dark, and she heard Isaiah swear, low and sharp, as he grabbed for a handhold. For half a second, no more, Myra felt the cold certainty that she had misjudged it, that the tide was already ahead of her, that she was about to put a 100-year-old boat and her own brother into black water with no one left who knew how to read what came next. Then the wheel came around under her hands the way it was supposed to, the bow steadied, and the feeling passed through her the way a held breath passes when you finally let it go. Not gone, exactly, but no longer choking her. On the relay vessel, lights along its hull flared and stuttered, not damage, Myra understood later, but confusion, its instruments registering a current profile that matched nothing in any record it had ever been given, a data anomaly with no file to slot itself into, exactly the way the registry's own doctrine had taught it to treat anything it couldn't classify, hesitate, flag, wait for confirmation. It never got the chance to confirm. The iron tide came through the cove the way it had come through that strait for longer than anyone alive had a memory of, all at once, 6 feet of water moving like something forged, and Myra held the Constance's will steady into the surge instead of away from it, aiming not for the relay vessel's hull but for the taut, straining line of its forward anchor chain, exactly where Isaiah crouched ready with 60 feet of harbour chain of their own. The old tug's iron bow hit the anchor line at a combined speed neither vessel's instruments, human or otherwise, had ever been asked to plan for, and something down in the black water gave way with a groan that Myra felt in her teeth. The relay vessel, suddenly free on one line and fighting a current it had no model for, began, slowly and then very much not slowly, to swing broadside into the surge. It did not sink. It did not need to. A vessel built to sit anchored and still, drawing its authority from a fixed and trusted reference point, is a very different thing once the water underneath it decides, for one night a year, to stop cooperating with anything anyone ever wrote down. Myra brought the Constance hard about the moment the chain went slack, cutting away from the relay vessel's swinging hull before the surge could carry them into it, and for a long, breathless minute she fought the wheel through water that no longer had any pattern she could read at all, water that had stopped being the strait she knew and become, briefly, something older and less interested in her survival than she needed it to be. Isaiah lay flat in the bow, one arm hooked through a cleat, shouting something she couldn't hear over the roar of the current, and somewhere behind them, lights along the relay vessel's hull strobed red and then amber and then a color that had no name humans had ever needed, sweeping wildly across water that would not hold still long enough to be measured. By the time the iron tide finished tearing through that cove 40 minutes later, the relay vessel had dragged its second anchor half a mile down the coast, its system still visibly, uselessly recalculating, and every signal it had used to pin down Kestrel Sound Harbour, its people, its records, had gone dark and stayed dark. Because whatever it had been listening to for a fixed and reliable truth about that stretch of water no longer existed anywhere it could find it. The Constance limped home at dawn with a crumpled bow and a proud, exhausted, freezing crew, and by the time she reached the dock the whole village was standing on it, and somewhere in the crowd, wrapped in a blanket someone had thrown over his shoulders in the confusion of a night that had ended better than anyone had dared plan for, stood Anders Calder, released, the villagers would learn later, in the same general chaos that had scattered half the registry's ground personnel when there. Relay vessel's authority over the region simply evaporated at 3 in the morning. He didn't say much. He never did. He stood on the dock and watched his granddaughter bring a broken boat home on a night the water had tried, honestly and thoroughly, to kill everyone on it, and when she finally cut the engine and climbed down onto the ice, he put both hands on her shoulders and looked at her for a long moment the way he'd looked at the strait 1,000 mornings before. Behind him, Ruth Halvorsen was already organizing blankets and hot coffee with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had spent a lifetime turning crises into logistics, and Isaiah stood at the rail of the battered Constance, grinning despite a split lip and a hand he'd almost certainly broken somewhere in the last hour, accepting the crowd's astonished questions with the air of a man who fully intended to tell this story at every gathering in Kestrel Sound for the rest of his life, and probably did. "Well," Anders said, "guess I don't have to worry about writing it down after all." "You were never going to write it down," Myra said, her voice cracking somewhere between a laugh and something closer to tears. "You said so yourself. Water doesn't read." "No," Anders agreed. and for once there was nothing dry or careful in the way he said it. But it turns out it listens just fine, if you've got somebody standing on it who knows how to ask. The registry left the region within the week. There was no formal surrender, no broadcast explanation. The ships that had spread that patient, world-eating silence over the northern coast simply lifted, one by one, and did not come back, and the coast, slowly, began to hum with its own small noises again. Radios, and school computers, and the general store satellite phone, all of it stuttering back to life like something waking from a long, cold sleep. Nobody in Kestrel Sound ever learned exactly why. Ruth Halvorsen liked to say it was because a planet that beats you with something it never wrote down is a planet you can't finish cataloging, and an occupier that can't finish its catalog eventually decides the file isn't worth the trouble. What Kestrel Sound never knew, and never would, was how close to true that guess actually was. Somewhere far above the reach of any radio the village would ever own again, in the last hour before the registry's ships broke formation and turned for open space, Overseer Thal sat with the final assessment of the northern region open in front of her, and stared for a long time at a line she had written herself and could not make resolve. Asset class, unrecorded. Status, unresolved. Recommendation, none available. In 1100 years of cataloguing worlds, it was the first entry her doctrine had never given her a category for, and there was, in the quiet registry way of admitting defeat without ever using the word, something almost like respect in the fact that she simply closed the file rather than continue to argue with a stretch of water that had never once agreed to be known. Kestrel Sound rebuilt what it needed to rebuild, and kept, out of habit more than necessity, most of what it had learned to do without a screen. The typewriter stayed on the counter of the general store long after the internet came back, mostly because nobody could bring themselves to admit they'd missed the sound of it. Anders lived another 6 years after that, long enough to see the harbour rebuilt, long enough to complain, at length and with great satisfaction, about how the co-op's new boats all had screens on them that told you nothing worth knowing about the water underneath. He never did write anything down, not a page of it, right up to the end, though people asked him to, more than once, including a young historian from the State University who drove 11 hours up the coast specifically to ask and left, 3 days later, with a notebook full of stories and not one single usable navigational fact, which Anders considered, privately, the correct outcome. What he did instead, in those last years, was what he had always done. He took people out onto the ice, and made them stand still, and taught them to stop trying to catch the water and let it come find them instead. 10 years on a grey winter morning much like any other, a girl of about 7 stood at the wheel of a small boat on Kestrel Sound, watching a strip of open black water ahead that looked, to her eyes, wide enough to run straight through. "Why'd you turn?" her grandmother asked, from the stern, in a tone that was not really a question at all, because the girl had already put the wheel over 10 degrees east, away from the lead, without being told. "It's sitting on a pressure line," the girl said, frowning in concentration, the tip of her tongue caught between her teeth the way it always was when she was thinking hard. "It'll close before we are halfway through." Myra Calder smiled, and said nothing at all, because some things, she had learned a long time ago, were worth more taught than told.